Hello there. In this video I'm going to be going over how to create some fire effects in RPG Maker. I'll be animating them in Piskel and tweaking them a bit in Photoshop, although that's not completely necessary to do that second step. You can see here some examples of what we'll have at the end of the video. Some of these look better than others, but this is what we've got. Okay, so here is Piskel. Going to set the size first. Just going to use 48 by 48. Now the first thing I'm going to do is set up a palette. I'm going to use 5 different colors. So I'm just going to create a bit of a gradient from yellow to red. Now you could use more colors or fewer colors. I went with 5. It seems to be a good number. Just going to throw some of these colors onto the canvas here to make sure they work out. Yeah, those colors seem to gel together properly. Alright, so let's clear this away. We'll start animating. So I'm going to work from the lightest color down to the darkest. And I'll be making use of some layers. So let's start off with a seed, where the fire will be emanating from. We'll do this over 3 frames to get it sort of jiggling around a bit. And I'll turn on this onion skin so I can get a look at what's going on the previous frame and the next frame. So now each of these frames is slightly different from the previous. So if we look at the top right there, it's sort of jiggling around a bit, which is exactly what we want. I'm going to add some bits flying off of the seed here. Sparks or flames, whatever you want to call them. And I want them to be directional, so they're gonna sort of pop into place and then fade out. So we got one on the left here. We'll start another one off down at the bottom. And we'll do a third one somewhere in the middle. So now we look at the top right. That's looking, we got something going on there. It's a good start. Alright, so I'm going to name this layer Bright. Make a new layer. Call it Step 1. And I'll put this layer beneath the first layer. And we'll move over to that next shade on our palette. Although I think I have to turn up the opacity on the layers so they don't get transparent. Alright, so yeah, now we can paint underneath. Okay, starting off on this layer, we just essentially outline everything to start off with here. We'll give a bit of thought to the direction that these particles are traveling when we go to outline these. Alright, so as it is right now, we look at these particles and they're traveling very linearly. Just straight up and a little bit to the right. And we don't exactly want that because fire tends to wave around a bit. Sort of like smoke, sort of like hair, sometimes even like water. It doesn't really move straight. So we need to add some undulation. Alright, I'm going to move on to the third layer now. And the third color in our palette. Call this layer Step 2. Same process as before. I'm just going to outline the shapes of the previous 2 layers. But I'm going to add an additional step here. Where the particles end at the top, I'm going to continue them on using this darker color so that they sort of fade into the background a bit more. Alright, so here I'm starting to incorporate some more curves onto that second layer to try to get away from that linear movement. That's looking a bit better. I'll be adding 3 more frames to this in a moment to do some in-between stuff. That should help to clarify some of these curves. Takes a bit of time to fine-tune some of these shapes. Sometimes things just don't look right. Okay, so I spent a chunk of time fixing up that second layer, step 1. This is what I came up with. So now I'll be moving back on to step 2 again. Starting off with some outlining. Alright, with all that outlining done, I'm going to add in those extra frames I was talking about. So a new frame in between each existing frame. This is just going to be to smooth out the animation overall. It would be totally possible to do the animation with just 3 frames if you wanted to. The more frames you use, the smoother the animation can look. So I'll speed through this process because it's basically just trying to average out the positions between the frames. The onion skin's useful for that, for at least some of these layers, although for the other ones it actually sort of gets in the way and you have to flip back and forth between the layers. Okay, with all those layers finished up, all that in-between done, the animation's looking pretty smooth right now. It's maybe a bit jittery in some places. We'll keep working on that though. We're gonna move on to the 4th layer, the 4th palette color. Oh, just outlining everything. Alright, all that outlining is done now. We're going to continue some of these particles further up the sprite. Let me just slow down the frames per second for a moment. So I'm looking at the animation here, and it seems like this sort of globule of fire that's creeping along the left and then shifts over to the right. I think it sort of shrinks a bit too quickly, so I need to expand one of these frames a bit, and that should fix things up. Yeah, that's looking a lot better now. Alright, so I'm going to fade some of these particles at the top using the darker color. And as these particles and shapes get further away from that seed at the bottom, they're going to move a bit slower. So any movement that's happening closer to the origin, it's going to travel very quickly. By the time it gets to the top, it's lost a lot of its energy and it's just sort of drifting. Alright, so we'll make that final layer now. That 5th palette color. Starting off, just like with the other ones, we'll just outline everything. Make sure it's at the bottom. And I'm looking at that now and I'm thinking it may not be dark enough. So I think I'm actually going to jump in there and change the color just a bit. Yeah, that's looking better. Alright, so with all that outlining done, we're going to extend some of those particles just a bit more as they fade away and get a bit darker. And that should be it for the pixel animation portion of the video. Gonna take this over to Photoshop after that. Though before we do that, I might want to add in a few extra particles at the top. Just throwing a few in here and there, just as the hot gases dissipate. Alright, so I'm going to export this as a PNG file. I'll just call it Fire1. Alright, so here we have the animation. This is what it will look like when it's saved. Now we could shrink the width of this animation a bit to save some space, I guess, just to optimize it a bit more. But I'm not going to worry about that for now. Let's open this up in Photoshop. And if you don't have Photoshop, you're good to go as it is right now, but I'm just going to do a few extra things here to get more use out of this. So I've already got the grid set to 48 by 48, so when I turn that on, it shows like this. Now, there's no 1 or 2 or 20 things that you could or should do here, but I'm going to go through, I don't know, I'll go through a few options that you can look at. So I'll duplicate the layer here, I'll give it a gradient, and I'll set that layer to luminosity, and I'll play around with the opacity of that layer, so you can get some interesting effects by doing that. I don't know if that's really working for what I want here. I think I'm going to try something else. I know that I definitely want to incorporate a gradient here. So I think the best way to do that probably just going to be to duplicate the layer twice and have one layer set to darken, one layer set to lighten. On one of those layers, I'll delete the top half of the image, and the other I'll delete the bottom half. And then I can play around with the color and the contrast of each of those overlays. Alright, so for this layer, I'll delete the top half. Let's play around with some of these lighten modes. Screen seems to work pretty well. So there's a lot of different options here. I'm going through different color modes, different opacities. You gotta find what you want. Alright, for this layer, I'm gonna delete the bottom half. Put it on darken mode. Let's just crank down the maximum there. Play around with the saturation and the color. And multiply is probably not gonna work. I think darken's probably the best bet here. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's merge those together. Now I'm gonna duplicate again. And on this layer, I'm going to just do a blur. Just a 1 pixel blur. I'm gonna duplicate it a few times just to give it some thickness. And I'll move it beneath that original layer. I'm gonna play around with the color a bit, see if I want to change it. I don't think I did end up changing it, but... Alright, it looks like I locked the transparency and filled it with solid red. Alright, so I'm gonna turn down the opacity on that blurred layer and save this as a ping file, and I'll call this Fire 2. And when I get to putting these in RPG Maker, I'll show you the difference between the two of them. Okay, so I'm bringing up the project folder for my RPG Maker project here. In this Doodads folder, I've already got a whole bunch of animations I've made. Here's a fire animation I made in the past. So I'll drag those 2 animations I've just made into this folder, and I've got to name them properly. There's a particular syntax. You'll see here, it's got the name of the file, and then this suffix that says how many frames of animation there are and how many rows. So these are going to be called. They're going to have a suffix of 6 by 1. All right, with those images renamed, we're good to fire up RPG Maker and test these out. All right, let's try these out on a different map here. Let's use this forest. Let's put the player over here and fire it up. No pun intended. All right, here we are. Let's place some doodads. Just pressing F10 to do this. There's our folder showing up list of all the different animated doodads here. Alright, there's the first one we made. This is before doing anything with Photoshop. I'm pressing T to get to these options. I'm gonna play around with the speed, the scaling, the transparency, and the blending mode. So I'll place a few of these fires down on the map. And I'm going to try messing around with the color a bit here. Alright, so that's playing around with that animation a bit. Let me switch over to the other one. Alright, here let's start off really big and make the animation very slow. low transparency too. Right here. So I'll place a few of these around. Let's flip it. Alright, let's crank up the opacity a bit. Shrink the size and turn up the speed. Now I'm probably making use of way too many of these items here. If I planned this out a bit better, I could probably use fewer instances and get a similar looking effect. But I'm not really too concerned about optimizing this right now. And lastly, I'll show a few other fire animations here. If you sort of mix and match some of these different animations, you can get some variety. So I can add a bit of a glowing effect to the ground with this animation here. Well, that's all for this video. I hope it was helpful, and thank you for watching.